Hello, my name is Mark Taylor. Welcome to the Education on Fire podcast network. This show is sponsored by the National Association for Primary Education. Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place where we share creative and inspiring learning in our schools. Season 6. Episode 89. Hello and welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast with me, Mark Taylor. Today on our English season, I'm joined by Daniel Phelps, and he's from Planet Poetry and the University of Winchester. Welcome, Daniel. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello, Mark, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you.
So let's start off with a little bit about you in terms of what your day-to-day looks like and some of your background.
Okay, well, I have a rather mixed background. I started out as a primary school teacher and worked in several local schools as well as education other than at school. I then moved in and I started working actually for a local young carer service. So that's supporting young people who are looking after somebody in their family with an illness or disability or long-term health condition. And that gravitated into me working at a national level, working on development and policy issues in regards to young carers. And now that's taken another step forward, really, and I do research now at the University of Winchester, and I'm working for a university in Switzerland as well on the issue of young carers, researching the impacts on them and looking at how we can move support and policy forward for them.
And so how did Planet Poetry come about, and how does that fit into the mix of all those things?
Okay, so how does it fit into the mix? I've always had this sort of writing streak that has always tried to come out, but it's not always been, as many of us know, it's not always been conducive with our day-to-day job and our work life. And I will talk in a minute about this novel, my first novel that I've written, Xientifica SOS. But throughout my work life, it's been very pressurized. Obviously, being a teacher, it's a huge workload. And one of the ways that my writing came out was starting writing poetry. And I had some very early successes with that, and it was published in lots of young people's anthologies and on websites. And actually, I rose to the dizzy heights of having some of it on the BBC CBeebies programme. And so that's carried on whilst I've been working. But I've always had this urge to pull out a proper novel, full novel, which I have just done recently, as I say.
So why don't you take us into that? Tell us a bit about the novel and what it's all about, and how people can get excited about going out to buy it.
Okay, sure. So the novel, as I say, is called Xientifica SOS, and you probably won't be able to spell that, but it's spelt with an X, as in xylophone. So I first drafted Xientifica SOS, you won't believe, but it was almost 20 years ago. So it was when I was actually teaching. And at the time, I thought that the power of narrative was not being used significantly or enough. And I set out actually, first of all, to write a series of standalone chapters or modules. But I got carried away, and I took 6 months out of teaching. I did supply teaching actually for 6 months, and I worked for education other than at school. And it gave me the flexibility to write. I got carried away, and these standalone modules morphed into one long, full novel, and that's where it remained. Though it remained on my hard drive. I read it to my class when I went back into teaching, and they appreciated, but I just didn't have the time to take it any further. So that was the genesis of Xientifica. And a few years ago, I was taking one of my children around a college, and I bumped into a former pupil of mine, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Phelps, I remember you. I'm just off to, I think it was Cambridge or Oxford, and I'm studying biological sciences there. And I remember the book that you read us in class all those years ago." So I was inspired by this, and I started reading the book to my own children, and they, despite their initial reservations, they enjoyed it. So I decided that I had to do something with this, that it had to see the light of day.
And what's within the book? What's the premise? What's the story behind it, and how does it develop?
Okay, so without giving too much away, I was inspired by the Coral Island when I read it as a child, and the Enid Blyton books, and the Lord of the Flies particularly. So you may be able to have a guess as to what the story is. But the premise is that there's 5 pupils from Fir Trees Primary School, and each of them has a gift, mainly around science, and they win a competition. And this competition is fantastic. It's a trip to America, to this theme park. But what happens is this adventure turns sour, and it starts turning into an adventure of a lifetime where they have to fight for their survival. And it's full of challenges, dangers, but also wonder as well.
I'm just thinking back to what you were saying about, the ex-student who remembered you talking about the stories and all of those kind of things. What is it, do you think, about actually that kind of narrative in terms of actually the teacher-pupil relationship when you actually have a story and a journey that you're taking on, which also has such a big impact? Because I can certainly remember thinking back to my childhood and actually having teachers, oh, now we're on carpet story time and that kind of thing. And there's quite a special feeling about that, isn't there?
There is, and I too remember when I was 5, I think, and I was sitting at the foot of my teacher, and she was reading Emile and the Detectives, and I can remember it as clear as anything. And that's the power of narrative, when you are engrossed within a story. And I wanted to use that. I think that the power of narrative is fantastic in itself, just to get lost and for the pure enjoyment. But it also has the potential to support learning in a variety of ways. And I wanted to pick up on that.
And what is it about the actual experience of writing in that way that inspired you to do it? Was it just that you wanted that particular story to come out? Because, like you say, it sort of happened over a long period of time. Or was there something, I don't know, more cathartic about just that sort of writing process?
I think for me, people say that within everyone there's a book, and this was my book, or at least my first book, and the stories that I mentioned, the Coral Island, Lord of the Flies, these had a huge impact on me. And first of all, I set out in life, I wanted to be a marine biologist, which I didn't become yet. A friend of mine did, but I didn't. So they stay with you, and when I think back to those stories, it comes with a whole load of mental imagery, pictures, and all the things that I learned from those books, and all the wonder that I have inside of me. And I wanted to get that out in a new book for a fresh audience.
And in terms of, you said about the time and the people that are under pressure by having a day job, whether it's a teacher or whatever it happens to be, but you've got this creative urge within you. What advice would you give in terms of having been in that place and actually then managed to produce something to then give to the world, in terms of how you go about that? When you can shelve it and never do it, or you could go all in and spend all your time on it, but how did you sort of work out that sort of emotional strand of kind of, I know this is important to me and I need to do it, but at the same time I still have my life in order to go day to day?
I mean, Mark, that's a good question. That's a fantastic question. I don't think I have a full answer, but some of the things that I would say is that, first of all, people say, if you're a writer, the first thing you have to do is turn up at your desk, and you have to do that regularly. So, that's an investment in time, and I think timing is important. If you have a young family, for example, if you have a busy job, it's not the right time necessarily. But you can still make some steps towards that goal. If you have the goal, if it's deep within you, then you can do it. So the steps that you can make, you can start making plans. You can collect notes. You can collect ideas. But then you have to choose the right time to do it. And I actually had a window of opportunity this time last year. I had a few months, and I thought, well, I'm not going to have this time again. I'm going to do it, and I did, and I met my illustrator, lovely lady called Beth Gibbs from the Winchester School of Art, and that was also having that other connection. It gave me more of a responsibility to complete the task, having a partner to work on this book with me.
I think there is definitely, isn't there, something about when there's a something in the sand that says on this date or in this opportunity of whether it's the summer holidays or whether it happens to be by the time I get to Christmas I'm going to have done X, Y and Z, that actually enables you to move forward. Otherwise it does just sort of tick along as something which is going on and on and on and on. And I do find it interesting, that kind of process of when those things start to change enough. And I think actually, like you said, being patient, there is often a time and a place for these things, and it may be when you've got a small family you just really don't have the time, or when you're in a really high stressed job and you've got lots going on, that's not the time as well. But I think if you're just able to separate those things out enough to know that there's something in there that is important to me, which I will then go, whether that happens to be writing a book or whatever it is that you're passionate about, you will find the time. And if you allow that time to come in whichever way it is, then and anything is possible within that. And I think you're a great example of that. As you said, it's happened over a long period of time, but when that time comes, and with the support of other people, or like you say, with the responsibility of working with someone else, then that does sort of produce its final conclusion.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, to be fair, I think the end product that I've got now is much better than what it was 20 years ago. And I think my work life has helped me develop those skills to write better, and certainly the writing of the poetry, which was doable over the last sort of 20 years, has certainly increased my skills. So I think it's turned out much better. It's just taken a long time, and as you say, I think patience is the key.
And let's talk a bit more about the poetry and your Planet Poetry website. What type of poetry is on there, and what sort of material is there for people to look at?
Sure. So it's the website is called planetpoetry.co.uk, and it's children's poetry primarily, although there's a link to some adult poetry as well, and it's primarily it's a range of fun, entertaining poems. I do tend to try and create poems that are inspiring, motivating, but also that help young people and adults think. So, some of them are quite challenging, I hope, but a real mix.
And in terms of, for our teachers listening, certainly, in terms of doing poetry in school and their whole idea of how literacy is taught or experiences children, I mean, do you find actually your experience of having written like that is really helped you when you were a teacher, and in terms of teachers who are looking for material these days?
Well, I think any kind of outside interest or skill or activity that the teachers undertake, I think they're all fantastically useful, because you're bringing other dimensions into the classroom, aren't you? So, I mean, just going back to the poems themselves, one of the things that I've tried to do is to use them as a teaching vehicle. I mean, we all remember, don't we? We remember clearly all the nursery rhymes that we learn as children, and they are embedded in our brains. We all know Humpty Dumpty. We all know 10 green bottles. Now, do we actually use that? And so I've written quite a lot of poems that they're actually teaching real important concepts, so that children learn it. And I'm amazed. I'm still amazed, really, how capable children are able to learn when they're not learning. When they're simply having fun. You only have to look in the playground, and they pick up skills and crazy dances and all sorts of things when they're just having fun. And
I guess that brings us very nicely on to how children are learning at the moment in the classroom, in terms of one of the things, my daughter's just gone to secondary school, and one of the first things she said was, when she saw her timetable, was, "Oh, I don't have to do English first thing every single day." and I just thought, just the I don't know, the energy and the emotional attachment to that, which was kind of, because she seems to really enjoy English in terms of stories and in terms of, you know, creativity, but just the way that felt, of terms of first thing every morning I've got to do some kind of English and I need to know this type of thing. What are your thoughts on how we can get that fun back, and that just so that children aren't being sort of shut off to having to do X, Y, and Z, and actually having that freedom to learn in that fun environment?
Well, I mean, I concur with your daughter totally. When I started teaching, it was in the early days of the National Literacy Scheme, and you know, I found it very, very restrictive, and I wasn't a fan of, you know, having a text up on the board and dissecting it to death. And as an aspiring author, I certainly didn't like that, and you know, we've heard many authors say the same thing. Yeah, so you know, we don't want to kill the enjoyment of reading, and so it's a balance, isn't it? You know, we've got to give young people the space to enjoy writing for what it is, and to get lost in it, like I did through Emil and the Detectives, etc. And you know, that was partly the reason that I wrote Xientifica SOS. I had this idea that on a Friday afternoon I would be able to read this to my class on a weekly basis. And, you know, I thought it was justified because although the timetable was incredibly tight and restrictive, this was going to be teaching science as well. So it was going to double up as a science lesson. And so that was my motivation.
And I think what I really enjoy about that as a concept is that actually, I mean, maybe it takes us a bit deeper into, you know, giving the teacher the responsibility and the respect as a professional to enable to do that. But what's really key there is the fact that as the educators ourselves, we're actually given the scope and the understanding. Let us give you the learning that you need, but let us deliver it in a way which we know the children will really grab hold of. And like I say, within that skill structure, you can make such a big difference. And because you know your children the best as well, you know, that kind of personalised learning within that can really, really support so many people.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the issue with that is that it takes probably more time to plan in depth, and as we all know, time is of the essence, and there possibly isn't that time. Although, you know, it was certainly done in the past, and maybe we're trying to cram just too many things, too many facts into our young people these days.
So, if there are any aspiring writers out there who are thinking, do you know what, I really would like to write a book or create a story or sort of for their own real enjoyment and their own real benefit, can you share some of the things that you found really supportive for you? And I'm not a writer myself, so I have no idea about this. But in terms of, you know, is it really important to have a complete overview? Is it important to have all these characters, you know, really sort of in depth before you start, or is it much more free flowing than that? And I guess that's different for every author, but certainly share us your experience of how you went about it.
I think you're right. I think it must be and is different for every author. As I said, you know, mine went totally off piste. My plan, it was going to be a series of standalone modules, and it wove together into one long novel. So yeah, I went off piste totally. It also develops. It's organic. It's alive as you write it as well. So yeah, you have a goalpost which you aim for, but you don't necessarily get it in the goal, and you score another goal. So you reach a different destination, I'm sure, often.
And I guess that's the great thing about creativity, isn't it? Is just almost getting out of those sort of confines that you have in so many parts of your life or so many areas of the curriculum. Is actually just when you're doing it purely for yourself, you can make up the rules to some extent and actually just go with the flow, and then from there your experience grows each time that you do it, and I think it's an interesting thing, especially for students these days as well, where there are so many rules of things that you have to do. I think they find it slightly difficult sometimes to have that freedom, and I think maybe just a combination of some structure within that actually gives them the more support to do those things.
Absolutely. I mean, education for me is much broader than that. It's about nurturing creativity, nurturing curiosity. Helping children learn how to learn and developing it and encouraging, lifelong learning habits. I mean, it has to be that. That's what we want them to do when they leave school. So we need to help those things when they're at school.
In terms of the future of your book and those kind of things, we chatted just a little bit before in terms of gamification. How do you sort of see how you'd like it to take on a life beyond just being something that you can read?
Sure. So, I mean, my first hope is that Xientifica SOS, that children enjoy it, pure and simple, that they enjoy it as a book, as an adventure. And I've tried to put in there a lot of descriptive bits because not everybody's going to be able to travel to some of the places that I'm describing, and that's important. Secondly, I wanted to inspire young people with to look at the world differently and to see science all around us because it's there, but also to see the beauty of science as well. Thirdly, I wanted to support people's learning. All the characters are continually asking questions of each other, of themselves. So I wanted to encourage questions. It helps, and I will go into this in a minute, hopefully, but it helps children to learn concepts, and it also helps them to remember facts and figures. And I've woven in lots of different memory tricks into the narrative. So, I think it's perfect for personal reading, for homeschooling, but also to be read as a class. And it's a fantastic launchpad, I think, for children to ask questions and to start exploring science themselves.
So it sounded a little bit like the book itself is like a spark for learning and understanding and exploration. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is and how that sort of works for you?
Sure. So my degree was in experimental psychology, which was many years ago now. But I took away from that some simple messages about learning and teaching. And one was that children are wired to learn. They naturally pick up things. And we all know that. Secondly is that children learn brilliantly from each other. The third one is that context is vital. Context provides meaning, and it helps us understand and remember things as well. And fourthly, that enjoyment and interest are absolutely key. So I felt that stories, that narrative, are able to offer all these key elements of learning. So, for example, I'm hoping that the story will bring interest and enjoyment. Young people may not necessarily enjoy looking at a science textbook, for example, but they love amazing science facts and they love stories. Secondly, the story, I hope, as I said, it brings meaning. And with meaning, it gives you a reason for learning things. So throughout my life, I've realized, reflecting on my own learning, that, the things that I've remembered that I've learned, it's things that I've seen a meaning to learning. Where I haven't seen the meaning, it's kind of just gone over the back of my head. And as I say, the third thing is that it helps young people, encourages them to ask questions themselves. So that's the kind of the general thrust of the book. But the second thing is that narrative is a fantastic vehicle for context. And context, as I say, it provides the meaning. So if I said to you, board of education, you may have an image in your mind. But if I expand the context there and I say, over there, Mark, is the room where the Board of Education meets. That's something quite different. So the context is, as we know, it's vital. And as I say, I call it a context web. The context web will help young people understand what's going on, but it also helps things stick to it, just like a spider's web. The third thing is that the story helps young people to remember facts and figures. So I've woven some poems in there, for example. And as I say, we all remember the nursery rhymes of our childhood. And for example, here we go. So here's one about forces. We are the forces. We push and pull and twist. We make things move and we make things stop. We slow things down and we speed them up. Now, gravity is a special force. It pulls things down to the ground. If we didn't have gravity while sitting on the lavatory, we'd all start floating around. So, I put in things like that throughout the book, and that poem goes on a bit. And I've also woven in other memory hooks. So, for example, I'll read you a little text. This is a conversation between the characters in the story, and they're looking at a sunset, and the conversation goes like this. The sun rises in the east, and that's over here, she said, nodding vaguely in the direction of our landing site. That's how I used to remember that the sun rose in the east, because yeast makes bread rise. So these memory hooks are replete throughout the book. The fourth thing is that the children, the characters themselves, they're teaching each other. And as I said, when you look at in the playground, the older children are teaching the younger children all sorts of things. And this is what I've tried to encompass within the story as well. So I'll give you an example of that. So the children, the characters, have just discovered this incredibly beautiful blue lagoon, and there's tumbling waters and rainbows all around them. So why do we get those rainbows? I asked, gazing into the tumbling waters. Well, I'm glad you asked that one, said Anna, because I've always wanted to know that. I kind of know, said Aisha, but I'm not sure if I can explain it. Oh, go on, have a go, Aisha, urged Anna. Okay, she sighed reluctantly, screwing up her face as she thought. The white light from the sun, she began, is made up of all the colours of the rainbow. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo and violet. I remember that from the run or you get boiled in veg. My brother made that up. Anyway, she continued, the water drops split up the sunlight into different parts, into its different colours. And that's it, really. We see all the different parts, all the colours.
So it really is just a case of, I guess, it, like you say, it captures that imagination. You start to understand it. And what I really liked about what you were saying there is you can really start to see how, as you're writing, putting this sort of educational learning ideas as well as the actual learning part, like you said, just from there in terms of the rainbow idea, that really sort of brings everything to life, and I think the people that will read it and if it's been read to them, I would imagine will be really inspired by that. So why don't you give us the details in terms of where they can get hold of it so that they can actually read it for themselves?
Sure. So Xientifica SOS, as I said, it's spelt with an X, as in xylophone, and there's no wizards or spells or anything like that. It's purely based on the wonder of nature, and I think there's enough of that out there for a lifetime. The adventure is aimed at children aged 8 to 12, although my father-in-law read it and I think he enjoyed it immensely. As I say, it's not a science book. It's first and foremost a children's adventure book, but it happens to have science in it. And you can buy this on Amazon, and it's in ebook form, Kindle form, but you can also buy a paperback copy.
So tell me, what are your thoughts on the future and how life will look like in the coming years?
Okay, so I think there's two things I'd like to say on that point. Firstly is around, well, we all have heard on the news continuously, really, about the stresses that children are under and the mental health crisis that we're facing with our young people. So I think for me, the more fun and excitement that we can bring to the classroom, the better. Where young people are enjoying learning, that's when they're going to be learning best, and that's going to be helping their mental health in general. The second thing is that we're competing, aren't we, against technology in all areas of life, and particularly in education. Young people are spending more and more hours engrossed in games and mobile phones, etc. And the reason is they're exciting. So education, it needs to be exciting. We need to keep up in some way. So sort of horizon scanning, I suppose. You remember the film The Matrix, of course. Neo in The Matrix, he learned karate in 2 minutes flat or whatever. And this was through a digitally downloaded training program where Morpheus was his coach and his fighting sparring partner. So I don't quite see that coming just yet. However, what I do see is that there's an increasing role for virtual reality simulations, a kind of hybrid, I suppose, between games and narrative stories where children are the agents in various simulations that have been carefully designed to provide learning opportunities and to explore, where they can explore different worlds. I think that the key thing here is that, we need some well-written training programs. So the narrative, if you like, needs to be strong. But yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of changes in education, and I don't think they're too far around the corner.
I think that's a really interesting concept, and I can see almost every child in a classroom putting their hands up to say, yes, we'd like to be doing that tomorrow if it became an option. And it does just remind me a little bit, because I was just thinking about the time of that, and how that as an idea would work in today's classroom. And just recently again, I was watching the Sal Khan from the Khan Academy talk on the TED Talk, and him talking about the whole flipped classroom idea in terms of children learning certain things at home via videos and learning in their own time, at their own, progressing at their own rate, which then frees up the classroom time, because then the teachers are able to support the children in what they've already learnt rather than delivering what they need to learn in class. And I thought it just reminds me then, I thought actually when they've understood concepts or when they've done certain things elsewhere, either if it's pre-class or in a different time, to then sort of have the time to then enhance that and support the things they've learned, and then add on to that while you're doing something again, like you say, in a sort of a virtual reality world or whatever, when you're able to really almost experience it as well as learn it. I think those two things together really sort of an exciting concept of how learning could be from the future onwards.
Yeah, so I think we have to be careful. I can see the teaching role shifting, if you like, to perhaps much more of a coaching role, guiding, inspiring, motivating, where teachers are, they act also as soundboards and helping the pupils reflect on their learning. More of a Morpheus type character, using the Matrix metaphor. But yeah, I think we still have to be very careful in how we go down that route. I don't think isolated learning is necessarily a good thing, and we are social beings, and I think that's very important. May I just read one other short episode of it? Short text.
Yeah.
We watched the sun set over the water. Slowly, it dropped in the sky, growing larger as it fell. By the time it reached the sea, it had become a huge golden orb. For a moment, it seemed, we could walk right over to it, across the sea, which now sparkled and formed a carpet of gold, leading to a faraway treasure. And what a treasure it was! Our sun, a star, one of billions, but to us, special. Our sun that gives energy and life to our little planet. 8 minutes is what it takes, I remember my dad saying. 8 minutes for its light to reach us. Just as the waves were coming towards us now and breaking on the reef, the sun's light was also coming towards us in waves, but much, much faster. About 150 million kilometers in 8 minutes. That's pretty fast, isn't it? If you tried to drive to the sun in a car, Dad had told me once, it would take you over 150 years. So the book as well, it weaves in over 50 scientific concepts, facts and figures, ranging from shooting stars, meteorites, satellites. It talks about air pressure, the Earth's atmosphere, rainbows, focusing of light and lenses. It talks about the oxygen needed to sustain the body, the circulatory system, friction, gravity, surface area, pressure, volume, rainbows, thunder and lightning, and the list goes on as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me, Daniel. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you, and I've certainly learnt a lot in terms of the writing process, in terms of how you've gone about it, and once again, it's planetarypoetry.co.uk is a place for all those poems and that part of the website, and you can get hold of the book on Amazon. Thank you very much for joining me today,
Mark. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for listening to the Education on Fire podcast. For more information of each episode and to get in touch, go to educationonfire.com. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.